Thank you all for your testimonies. To begin the questioning, you mentioned a moment ago how Dr. Tedros has not in any way, shape, or form retracted his false statements. Just for the record, I've met with Dr. Tedros when he was the Minister for Health in Ethiopia, and he often lied on behalf of Meles, who was then the head of state there, when they had cholera outbreaks. So he had a very checkered background going into that position as Director General of the World Health Organization. He got his job by way of the Chinese Communist Party in Xi Jinping. He was their candidate, and we saw that there was a great deal of disinformation, if not outright lying, when COVID broke out, as he did the work of the Xi Jinping's dictatorship in putting out a false narrative. So I'm no great fan at all. I supported the Brit who ran, who was all about reforming the WHO. But, again, these people need to be held to account when they make statements. And for him to smear Israel and not retract it and, frankly, offer a fulsome apology, again, goes to his integrity. And integrity matters. And I've been shocked at the fact that he has not come forward and said, wait, I got it wrong. Let me just correct that and apologize to the Israelis. Nothing of the sort. Just goes on to the next disinformation campaign. So if you might want to speak to that. The issue of diversion of aid. We know that so much of the aid from the European Union, and as well as from us, gets diverted by Hamas. What should have gone into infrastructure went into tunneling. And even a lot of the aid we believe that is being sent to UNRWA is diverted in other ways. It's hard to say because there's no independent accountability whatsoever. And, Mr. Lincoln, maybe you could speak to the issue of, if a UNRWA employee took a pro-Israeli position and said, we want nothing to do with anti-Semitism, what would happen to him or her should they take that position? One, they wouldn't get the job in the first place, but say they hit it. And they say, it's about time we got to tolerance and treated our Israeli and our Jewish friends with respect. What would happen to that person? Would they last the day? Would terrible things happen to them? And on the textbooks, I have met with the lobby forces. They've come around over the years for UNRWA, and they're very good at putting pretty much what we saw throughout the 80s and 90s when it came to communist dictatorships. I took on Nicholas Ceausescu in Romania and the Securitate, and every year the lobbyists in K Street would bring, because they wanted most favored nation status, and they had page after page of nice bullets of lies. And you'd look at it and say, but it worked. They kept MFN for years, most favored nation status, even though they were doing horrible things, in that case, to Christians in Romania as part of their dictatorship. My point is, a lobby firm and a lobby effort done here and elsewhere can put a gloss on the most egregious human rights abuse. So diversion, if you maybe could speak to that issue of funding. And what is taught? I've had briefings and hearings in the past. I had one witness once read from the textbooks in English, and it was not only anti-Jewish and anti-Israel, it was also anti-American. And it went page after page after page of that. They tell us that they clean up the textbooks, and we hear, you don't get a 15-year-old who is fanatically anti-Jewish and anti-Israel without starting at a very young age to inculcate that hate into that little boy and that little girl. And it works. It works. I've worked on the Charles Taylor issue. I've had hearings with the special prosecutor with regards to David Crane here in this room with what Charles Taylor did to hype up the young people to cut off arms and do horrible things. That's child abuse of the worst kind. And Hamas and the PLA does it every single day. And maybe you could clarify for the record, with regards to the content, the UN doesn't say what goes into those books, or the US or the donor nations. It comes from the PA, if I'm not mistaken. And again, that's highlighted again in the testimony in the most recent report that was put out. So I just want to underscore that. Handoff of UNHCR, you indicated, I think, Mr. Lincoln, you don't think that would happen. I mean, UNRWA is so flawed. I mean, if this was racism based on color of someone's skin, surely, and I was one of those Republicans who supported apartheid sanctions during the Reagan administration. And for a while, I was pretty much alone in that position. Finally, we all came to that position. So, because that was based on racism. Well, here we have a group that is all about racism against Jewish people. Well, we got to find some other entity, it would seem to me, because reform and the falseness of the reform in the past is numbing. Also, if I could, pay to slay. If that isn't an indicator of, I mean, we have Taylor Force, an American who in 2006 was killed, with a knife. 10 others were wounded. And what does his family get as he's languishing in prison? What do they get, and all others? They get a stipend, a lot of money from the Palestinian Authority. I mean, I still, my mind boggles at how cruel that is, and that's backed by a boss who has not gotten rid of pay to slay. I mean, the UN has been silent on that one for far too long as well. So, you could, maybe speak to the textbooks, I said this yesterday in a meeting we had with the ADL. That famous song, "You've Got to Be Taught," from South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein. Hatred is taught, and it's being taught with aggressiveness every single day to the youngest of Palestinians, and that is child abuse of the worst kind, because they grow up loaded for bear to kill Jews and to end the state of Israel. They don't just come by that when they're 15. They grow into it, and UNRWA is the major conduit to that. Hello. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the WHO. It is indeed shameful that Dr. Tedros has neither retracted nor deleted his false tweet accusing Israel of attacking a hospital. That is a horrific accusation, and it's false and never happened. You mentioned the role of China in the WHO. That is significant, has never been properly addressed in Geneva, where I'm based. The WHO, the previous director was also China's candidate. Literally, China was campaigning for her. She was their candidate. And they have substantial influence, even symbolically. Two of the goodwill ambassadors of the WHO, one is James Chow, who works for Chinese state TV and is a paid propagandist of the Chinese regime. He's a WHO goodwill ambassador. During COVID, he was publishing a lot of stuff praising China's methods of dealing with COVID. So outright propaganda. We exposed him. We had 100 NGOs complain about him. Nothing happened. Another goodwill ambassador is Peng Liyuan. She is the first lady of China, the wife of Xi Jinping. She's a WHO goodwill ambassador. In 1989, she's a singer. She was serenading the perpetrators of the Tiananmen Square massacre. She's a WHO goodwill ambassador. So WHO has a lot to answer for. You spoke about UNRWA, two issues, the aid and the education. On the aid, it's hard to get information on aid being diverted, but UNRWA itself a couple weeks ago reported that both fuel and medical equipment were removed from one of their warehouses and taken by the health authorities, which is Hamas. And they deleted their tweet an hour or two later, but Haaretz reported, Haaretz is a newspaper that is extremely critical of the Netanyahu government and generally supports UNRWA. They reported that according to their sources, this theft of UN humanitarian fuel and medical equipment did happen. According to the Israel Broadcasting Authority's Channel 11, 36,000 liters of fuel were taken. That is fuel that can run a hospital for a week and a half, can run a water desalination plant for a long period, stolen by Hamas terrorism. UNRWA education. We released our report, Impact SE has their report, and they talk about graduates of UNRWA who have committed terrorist attacks. And this is over the past 20 years, and they cite numerous graduates of UNRWA schools who commit terrorist attacks. So we, as the donor states, because all of our countries, whether you're American, Canadian, Swiss, French, British, we're all paying for UNRWA. America's the largest donor. We're told that that it's an investment for peace. What UNRWA never says is, of the 3,000 or so terrorists who infiltrated into Israel, how many of them were UNRWA graduates? One of them apparently had an UNRWA certificate from a vocational school that was found in Israel, and it was published on the internet, and this person had it on their person, this terrorist. So UNRWA does not reveal those statistics, but obviously they're substantial. So it's a question whether UNRWA is really educating for peace. You asked, Mr. Chairman, about what would happen if a UN official would say, I oppose anti-Semitism. Well, we've never seen it, so it's a valid question, and I hope that our colleague will answer. But unwittingly, certain things happen. A couple years ago, the director of UNRWA in Gaza, a German national by the name of Matthias Schmel, no friend of the Jewish people, no friend of Israel, someone who tolerated lots of anti-Semitism when he was head of UNRWA in Lebanon. He was interviewed on TV, and they asked him, can you tell us about Israel's attacks? This is in May 2021. Can you tell us about Israel's attacks on Gaza? And he said, yeah, but they've been very precise. They're only hitting the terrorists, and haven't been hitting us, civilians, UNRWA. And he didn't realize what he was saying, but he effectively acknowledged in very clear terms that Israel's attacks are precisely aimed at the terrorists. And Israel used his quotes and published his quotes, that the director of UNRWA confirms what we've been saying. Immediately, he became persona non grata in Gaza because he just said the truth. Wasn't trying to praise Israel, but he just said the truth. Became persona non grata. Suddenly, there were protests sprang up outside his office. He had to leave Gaza. He was fired. He had to get another job. So that is a partial answer to your question. Finally, no, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make note, when we talk about the WHO, every year during their annual conference, they devote a significant chunk of time just to excoriating Israel. This is part of their annual process. Even at the height of the pandemic, there was a full day dedicated at the WHO conference to talking about Israel, as if that had anything to do with the global pandemic. So you just get a little bit of a sense of the priorities of this particular UN agency. I would also note that right now, we all heard about the Al-Ahli hospital and the attack, or an errant rocket by the Islamic Jihad that created the explosion there. What we're not talking about yet, but what we will be talking about very soon, is the Al-Shifa hospital, which is based in Gaza City. Underneath the Al-Shifa hospital is the Hamas command center. It is several stories deep. We believe that there could be Israeli hostages held there. We believe that there is fuel that's been diverted there. We believe there are rockets down there. And of course, there is the command center that Hamas uses for whatever is left of its fighting force in Gaza right now. How is it that the WHO has not come out and condemned Hamas for what we already know exists beneath this hospital? This would be the time that the WHO should be speaking out, and it makes one wonder why it is that they exist in the first place if they can't come out and speak about something as abhorrent as that. Now, as far as diversion of aid, we are hearing right now, the best reports that I'm getting from Gaza, from Israel, is that the aid that is coming through to the south, which is what the international community has carved out, it is being diverted to the north, where Hamas's military command center is. It is happening in the underground tunnels. UNRWA has not said a thing about this. There is, and I think, as you just heard from Hillel, this is a certain amount of self-censorship, right? The story of Matthias Schmel, is that how you pronounce his name? Yeah. We remember, that he actually, he ended up having to leave Gaza. He was persona non grata. There's a lesson in there that UNRWA can't speak out about these sorts of things if they want to maintain the access, right? And so what they've done is they've prioritized the mission over the revelation of a lot of key details that I think the world needs to know about. UNRWA has to stop that self-censorship. And by the way, I can just tell you as just an anecdote, a few years ago when I went to visit the southern communities around the Gaza Strip, we actually were able to go into some of the tunnels that had already been exposed, and you could see that there were the bags of cement with the UNRWA logo littered on the floor of these tunnels. So you get a sense of where the building material may have come from. UNHCR, I do believe that this is the only way forward. I know there will be resistance to it, but the point is that for the legitimate refugees that need to get the assistance, let's work through UNHCR. For those that are destitute, for those that are in need of services that right now UNRWA is providing, let's move them over to the Palestinian Authority. Why are we still using the UN when these are basic services that any other government should be providing? It makes no sense. Why do the Palestinians have this and no other people do? The textbooks, I'm going to leave that to people who follow this a lot more closely than I do. The excuse, though, that these are textbooks that come from other places and therefore they don't have influence, that is absolutely not something that anybody should accept. What is taught comes down to the teachers, it comes down to the staff, and of course we know that many of the staff in UNRWA have an affiliation or an affinity for Hamas. That has to change.
Thank you. Just a quick maybe word on a couple of these points on the aid diversion. From 2017 to 2021, I was the manager of something called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which was a mechanism that was created in the wake of the 2014 war, which to date was the most destructive, and Gaza, of course, pales in comparison to what's happening now. But essentially, we worked with the Palestinian Authority and with the Israeli authorities to facilitate the rebuilding after 2014. The mechanism was functional, and in fact, even after May 2021, the Israelis moved to actually try and strengthen it. As part of their response. So just to say that accounted for the bulk of the reconstruction materials that came in after 2014 for the express purpose of rebuilding, and it had to do with UN doing end-use monitoring, et cetera. By no means a perfect system, but there were no complaints from the Israelis about that and about the diversion. It's understood that the cement and other materials come from other sources, including a completely unregulated and unchecked border between Egypt and Gaza that has been open since 2018. Just as one example. So that's important to mention. Also, just out of interest, interestingly, and it was of great annoyance to me as an official as a UN official working with the UN Special Coordinator's office at the time, UNRWA maintained its own mechanism, direct mechanism with the Israelis on the entry of materials. Again, not something that was raised by the Israeli security establishment as an issue. Later on, of course, as part of its these efforts that have now come under great scrutiny on the part of the Netanyahu government to try and support the economy and particularly try and engage indirectly with Hamas, there were efforts to try and support the economy. And this included creating certain economic conditions on the ground. But this came from again, from the Netanyahu government, from the Israeli government. And so there were definitely excess materials on the ground. Now, whether or not Hamas used any of this for its tunnels, whether they were able to smuggle the goods in, I have no idea myself. We were only able to account, and pretty well, for the materials that came in for the UN and internationally funded projects. Just on the employees, UNRWA needs to investigate this and act swiftly.
Suspend.
Sorry.
UNRWA investigate? How about an outside, independent-minded body? I mean, here in this place, everything is about checks and balances. So everything, House, Senate, Republican, Democrat, GAO, which does independent analysis.
To bring it all together, to combine that with the textbooks, and again, I am no expert on education curriculum. I have not worked in that in the past. UNRWA says that in cooperation with the US and other donors, it takes measures to address racism and bias. I understand that there's some skepticism here. If they are insufficient, I would imagine that a coalition of the top donors, which includes the United States, European Union, Germany, as just the top three, could influence the required changes. It's a question of political will more than anything, and it needs to be done in a multilateral fashion, just because of the nature of UNRWA and the way it works. There should be no obstacles within the UN system to this. I
Can you
would be
tell us
surprised.
how you account for young people being so anti-Jewish and anti-Israel who have gone through the UNRWA schools? Is UNRWA anti-Semitic?
I would say that you have to understand what UNRWA is. UNRWA
I know what it is.
is providing services to 70% of the population of Gaza.
Including schools.
UNRWA, I think we need to focus more on the problem, which is Hamas. UNRWA is deeply flawed. It is not Hamas.
Your view on the pay to slay?
In terms
is
of,
PLA?
there are a host of issues that are of deep concern regarding the governance of the Palestinian Authority.
Can you condemn that? I mean, killing Jewish and Americans and committing terrorism and then getting paid for it by the government.
Again, I'm putting it just in. Of course, condemn that, but you just putting it into the context of a broader necessity for reform within the Palestinian Authority. There have been many voices that are calling for this, and in particular, I would draw your attention to an article by Salam Fayyad in Foreign Affairs, former Palestinian Prime Minister, who has outlined a number of the vital reforms that are required in order to reinvigorate the Palestinian Authority if there is ever going to be any sort of future peace process or day after
Just let me ask
scenario
you,
that can stabilize the situation. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
If a UNRWA teacher
Yes.
were to be pro-Israel and pro, what would happen to that person? And do you know of any who show a tolerance, at least, towards Jewish people?
I don't know any UNRWA teachers, and I can't answer the question, Mr. Chairman. But I do know that any of these horrible instances that have been raised by these reports should be dealt with immediately.